Officer Daniel Carter's life was defined by routine, long hours patrolling the streets, responding to calls, and witnessing the countless struggles that unfolded in the city's heart. As a seasoned cop in his early 40s, he had learned to tune out the noise, to filter out the chaos that surrounded him. But that all changed on a scorching midsummer afternoon, when a fleeting encounter with a young girl thrust him into a mystery that would shake him to his core. It all began with a brief glance at a child, a small figure in a pink dress, clutching something she shouldn't have been carrying. What started as a simple concern for a child's safety quickly escalated into something far darker. A scrawled message on a makeshift cardboard sign, a missing child, a desperate plea for help. Carter soon realized that the world of this young girl, Nora, was far more complicated and heartbreaking than he could have ever imagined. What he uncovered would test the limits of law, compassion, and what it truly means to protect those who are most vulnerable. This is a story about an officer whose encounter with a frightened child leads him to confront not only the grim realities of the streets but also the limits of his own understanding of right and wrong. It is a tale of survival, sacrifice, and the lengths one man will go to for the sake of a child in need. The start of the investigation. It was a scorching midsummer afternoon, and the city of Millbrook was alive with the typical hum of urban activity. The streets buzzed with the usual distractions, honking horns, shouting pedestrians, and the ever-present sirens that were a constant reminder of the fragile balance between order and chaos. Officer Daniel Carter, who had been patrolling these streets for over 2 decades, knew the city like the back of his hand. He had learned how to tune out the distractions, how to navigate the chaotic buzz without letting it affect his focus. But even he couldn't ignore the deepening sense of unease that had begun to grow inside him as he drove through the familiar streets. Carter, a weathered cop in his early 40s, was no stranger to the gritty reality of city life. His blue eyes had become accustomed to scanning the streets with a detached efficiency, picking up on subtle details that others might overlook. It was a skill he had honed over the years, one that had kept him safe through countless encounters with danger. But as he passed the corner of 5th and Main, something caught his eye, a figure that didn't quite belong. A small girl, no older than 8 years old, was walking alone towards the entrance of a convenience store. Dressed in a vibrant pink dress that contrasted sharply against the drab surroundings of the neighborhood, she moved with an air of purpose. Carter's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his instincts kicking into high gear. In a neighborhood like this, at this time of day, an unaccompanied child was a rare and concerning sight. He knew something wasn't right. As Carter's patrol car slowly approached the store, he kept his eyes fixed on the girl. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the uneasy feeling in his gut deepened. His mind immediately began running through the possibilities. Was she lost? Was she in danger? Why was she out here, all alone? His years on the force had made him hyper-aware of potential threats, and this child was a red flag he couldn't ignore. In this part of the city, a child on her own was an anomaly. Carter had seen too many cases of abuse and neglect to simply drive by without making sure the girl was all right. He pulled the patrol car to the curb and put it in park. Minutes ticked by, but the girl didn't reappear. Carter sat in the car, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the store. His mind raced, running through the possibilities. It wasn't long before his unease turned to suspicion. What was this girl doing here? Why was she by herself in this part of town? He had seen far too many tragic stories unfold on these streets to brush this off as a simple case of a child being out of place. This felt different. This felt like a situation that needed his intervention. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the store opened, and the girl stepped back out, clutching a paper-wrapped sandwich in one hand and what appeared to be a bottle of alcohol in the other. Carter's heart sank at the sight. This wasn't just a child lost or wandering, this was a child in danger. The bottle of alcohol in the girl's hand confirmed his worst fears. An underage girl, alone in a dangerous part of town, holding something illegal. This was a situation that needed immediate attention. Without hesitation, Carter pushed open his door and exited the vehicle. His movements were deliberate, each step calculated, as he approached the child. He noted the way she was holding the sandwich in one hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around the bottle. But what caught his attention even more was the fact that she was barefoot. The sight of her bare feet sent a chill down his spine. In a city as dangerous as Millbrook, a child barefoot on the streets was a red flag. What was she doing here? Who had allowed her to walk around like this, unprotected and vulnerable? "Hey there," Carter called out gently, trying to keep his voice calm and non-threatening despite the urgency of the situation. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The girl's eyes snapped up to meet his, and for a brief moment, Carter could see the flicker of fear in her gaze. Her wide, innocent eyes locked onto his uniform, and in a split second, she tensed. Without warning, she dropped the sandwich and bottle and turned to run. Her small feet slapped against the hot pavement as she bolted away from him, moving with surprising speed for someone so young. Carter's heart raced as he watched her dash towards a narrow alley behind the store. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice tinged with both concern and frustration. But it was too late. The girl had already disappeared into the shadows of the alley, leaving Carter standing in the middle of the street, helpless. Carter cursed under his breath, breaking into a run. His mind was racing. How could she have disappeared so quickly? He had been only seconds behind her. As he reached the entrance to the alley, he stopped and scanned the area, his eyes flicking from one shadowy corner to the next. There were stacked boxes, overflowing dumpsters, and dark alleys leading in all directions. The girl could have easily slipped behind any one of these, but the fact that she had managed to vanish from sight so quickly unsettled him. The alley was empty. There were no signs of the girl. Not even a hint of her presence. He took a deep breath, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. He stood at the mouth of the alley, his heart still pounding in his chest, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. What had he just witnessed? How had she managed to disappear like that? Was there someone else involved? Was the child being watched or controlled by someone else? Every instinct told him that this was no ordinary runaway child. There was something far more troubling at play here. Carter's gaze shifted back to the convenience store. There was something about this situation that felt off, and he couldn't let it go. He turned on his heel and walked back towards the store, his mind consumed by the image of the barefoot girl and the bottle of alcohol in her hand. What was going on here? He had to find out. The bell above the door jingled as Carter entered the store, the cool air inside providing a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. But the air conditioning did little to ease the tension that had settled in his chest. His eyes quickly scanned the cluttered shelves and grimy floors, before landing on the man behind the counter. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a paunch that spoke of too many years behind the counter, was hunched over a stack of receipts. When he looked up, his expression changed from boredom to weariness at the sight of Carter's uniform. "Can I help you, officer?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice flat and unbothered. Carter planted his hands firmly on the counter, leaning in slightly. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "I'd like to know why you sold alcohol to a minor just now." The words hung in the air like a weighty accusation, and the shopkeeper's face immediately shifted from indifference to surprise. His eyes widened before narrowing with a defensive look. "Wait, hold on," the shopkeeper said, raising his palms in a placating gesture. "I didn't sell any alcohol to a minor. I don't know what you think you saw, but you're mistaken." Carter's jaw clenched in frustration. He had seen the girl with his own eyes, clutching what looked like a bottle of alcohol. She just left your store with a sandwich and what looked like a bottle of alcohol. Are you telling me that didn't happen? The shopkeeper's expression softened as recognition slowly dawned on him. "Ah, I know who you're talking about," he said with a sigh. "But officer, you've got it wrong. That little girl, she bought a sandwich and a bottle of water. Nothing else. Certainly no alcohol." Carter froze for a moment, disbelief flashing across his face. He had been so sure, so certain of what he had seen. But now, with the shopkeeper's calm and sincere denial, doubt began to creep in. "Water." He repeated the word in his head, his certainty slipping. "Water?" he asked, his voice a little less sure. "Absolutely," the shopkeeper said, nodding firmly. "Look, I've been running this store for 20 years. I know the laws. I would never sell alcohol to a kid." Carter studied the man's face, looking for any hint of deception. But all he saw was sincerity, and perhaps even a touch of indignation at the very suggestion that he would break the law. The officer felt the first stirrings of doubt in his own mind. He had been so focused on the girl, so sure of what he had seen. But now, in the face of the shopkeeper's calm assurance, he found himself questioning his own perception. "I see," Carter said, his tone softer now, the certainty that had driven him to confront the man quickly evaporating. "I apologize for the accusation. It seems I may have jumped to conclusions." The shopkeeper relaxed, his posture easing as the tension left his body. "No harm done, officer," he said. "We all make mistakes. I'm just glad we could clear this up." Carter nodded, still processing what had just happened. He turned to leave the store, but the feeling of unease remained, a quiet whisper in the back of his mind. He had been so sure of what he had seen, yet now he wasn't so certain. The image of the little girl, barefoot and holding what had looked like a bottle of alcohol, continued to haunt him. There had to be more to this story than a simple misunderstanding. Carter's growing determination. Carter climbed back into his patrol car, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. He sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the convenience store across the street. The heat from the sweltering afternoon air still hung in the car, but it was the unease gnawing at him that felt unbearable. The bustling streets of Millbrook continued to pulse around him, horns blaring, pedestrians rushing to and fro, the cacophony of the urban landscape. But inside the car, all that noise faded into the background. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of the young girl in the pink dress and the bottle she had been carrying. What had just happened? He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind, the way the girl had bolted when he approached her, her small form disappearing into the shadows of the alley, the shopkeeper's denial, and most troubling of all, the lingering image of her barefoot in the street. He had been so sure, so certain of what he had seen. Yet now, with the shopkeeper's calm, collected response, doubt began to creep in. Had he made a mistake? Had his instincts failed him? As the minutes passed, Carter felt the weight of his uncertainty pressing down on him. He couldn't let go of the memory of the girl, the look of fear in her eyes, the way she had dashed away from him without a second thought, and the eerie feeling that something much darker was lurking beneath the surface of this simple encounter. She had been running from something, that much was clear. But what? And why had she been so scared? These questions echoed in his mind, swirling around with no answers, no clear direction. He couldn't let go of the suspicion that something was very wrong. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. His shift wasn't over yet, and he had time. Time to follow this feeling, to push beyond his doubts and try to make sense of what had happened. Carter had learned long ago that sometimes, the smallest details held the key to unraveling a much larger mystery. And this situation, this strange encounter with a terrified little girl, felt like one of those moments. The decision to act was not a logical one. It was emotional, driven by something deeper than his training. Officer Carter had always been a professional, a man who relied on facts, evidence, and reason. But something about this case, the sight of the girl running from him, the odd combination of innocence and fear in her eyes, stirred a deeper sense of urgency within him. He had seen a lot of things in his time on the force, but nothing had disturbed him quite like this. And it wasn't just the girl that was bothering him. It was the fact that he hadn't been fast enough to help her, the guilt that was already beginning to take root in his chest. The guilt that whispered, "What if you could have stopped her from running?" Shaking his head, Carter put the car in gear and drove away from the store. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't just let this go. If the girl was in trouble, if she was being hurt or manipulated by someone, then it was his responsibility to find out. This wasn't just another case to file away. This was a life, a vulnerable child who needed someone to step in and protect her. As Carter drove through the streets of Millbrook, his thoughts remained focused on Nora. He found himself reflecting on his own experiences, the failures that had haunted him in recent years. The divorce had been the most obvious. 6 months ago, the papers had been finalized, and the empty house that awaited him at the end of each shift was a constant reminder of a relationship that had crumbled. But it wasn't just the divorce. There were the other failures, the cases he had been too slow to solve, the people he had failed to protect. Memories of a domestic violence case from the previous year, where hesitation had led to a woman being hospitalized, resurfaced in his mind. He thought about the drug bust that had gone wrong, the one where he had been too confident, too sure of his intel, and had missed a critical detail that led to disastrous consequences. Faces of those he had failed, victims who had been let down by the system, or by his own mistakes, flashed in his mind. The gallery of his shortcomings was like a gallery of ghosts, each face a reminder of how far he had fallen from the idealized version of himself he once believed he could be. But this case, the girl, Nora, was different. He could feel it deep in his gut. She wasn't just another case to solve or another statistic to add to the pile. This was a child. A vulnerable child who had been forced to live on the streets, to beg and survive in a world that had abandoned her. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let this be just another failure to add to the list. The streets blurred around him as he drove, the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Yet, through the haze of self-doubt, there was a flicker of determination. He was going to find her. He was going to make sure she was safe, even if it meant risking his own career, even if it meant stepping beyond the boundaries of what was considered normal protocol. Nora deserved that much. She deserved someone who would fight for her, someone who would believe her story even when there were no easy answers. Carter's mind raced with possibilities as he navigated the streets. He scanned the sidewalks for any sign of the girl in the pink dress. His eyes darted between pedestrians, his trained instincts filtering through the chaos to look for anything out of the ordinary. But the streets were packed with people, and there was no sign of the child. He slowed his patrol car, his eyes flicking from one face to the next, looking for the flash of pink that would lead him to her. Time passed, and the city continued to bustle around him, but Carter couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had to find the girl. Minutes turned into hours, and the oppressive heat of the afternoon began to fade into the cooler shadows of the evening. Carter's frustration grew as he continued his search, knowing that every minute that passed was another minute that could put the girl further out of reach. But even as doubt crept in, was he chasing shadows, imagining things? His determination only grew stronger. He had to find her. He couldn't let her slip away again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Carter's search took him into the heart of Millbrook, where the crowds had only grown denser. Streetlights flickered on, casting a golden hue over the crowded sidewalks. The evening energy of the city seemed to pulse with life. Carter moved through the crowd, scanning faces, looking for any sign of the girl he had seen earlier. And then, just when he was beginning to lose hope, his heart skipped a beat. There she was. In the distance, he spotted the unmistakable pink dress weaving through the crowd. His pulse quickened as he made his way towards her. She was still alone, her small form navigating the maze of tables and diners at an outdoor cafe. Carter felt a rush of relief flood through him, mixed with a renewed sense of worry. The girl was still out here, still vulnerable, still exposed to whatever dangers the city had to offer. He had found her, but now, he had to figure out what to do next. He hung back, keeping his distance, not wanting to spook her. Carter watched as Nora interacted with the diners at the cafe. Some of them recoiled from her approach, their faces a mixture of pity and discomfort, while others leaned in, giving her a fleeting moment of attention. It was clear that she wasn't just asking for food or money, there was something more complicated going on here. Was she begging? Selling something? Or was it simply that she had no other choice but to turn to the city's strangers for help? Carter's mind raced as he observed Nora. The sadness in her eyes was palpable, but so was the resilience in her small frame. She moved from table to table, each interaction a fleeting moment of hope followed by disappointment. Her face would light up with the smallest gesture of kindness, only for that light to fade as she moved on to the next person. There was something almost heartbreaking about the cycle, the way she would lift her head with hope, only to be met with rejection or pity, leaving her shoulders to slump and her pace to slow. He couldn't just watch her anymore. This child, this brave little girl, was lost in a world that had failed her. And Carter had the power to change that. He could no longer stand by and let her slip through the cracks. The search in the crowded streets. The evening air in Millbrook had grown cooler, and the city was just beginning to shift into its night rhythm. Officer Daniel Carter walked among the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of hurried pedestrians, tourists, and street performers. The vibrant energy of the city, its chaos, its rush, its noise, had always been part of the backdrop of Carter's daily existence. But tonight, it felt different. His usual detachment had vanished, replaced by a deep, urgent sense of purpose. Every face he passed held a potential clue, every alley could be hiding the girl, and every street corner might lead him closer to finding her. His patrol car now felt distant, left parked on a side street as he moved on foot through the bustling outdoor cafes. The air was thick with the smell of grilled meats, the spicy aroma of food mingling with the exhaust from passing cars. The clinking of glasses, the hum of laughter, the occasional clatter of silverware, all of it blended into a strange, almost surreal soundtrack as Carter's gaze darted back and forth. This was the city he knew so well, yet tonight, it felt like a foreign land, full of shadows and unanswered questions. The girl, Nora, had vanished into the crowd, but Carter wasn't about to give up. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, he wasn't sure what he would do once he did find her, but all he knew was that he couldn't walk away from this. Something about Nora, something in the way she had run from him, stayed with him. Her fear, her vulnerability, the feeling that she was slipping through the cracks of society, it haunted him, and it propelled him forward. Carter pushed through the crowd, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. The city's pulse continued to beat around him, but he was no longer part of it. He was focused on one thing, finding the little girl in the pink dress. The crowds were dense now, with tourists snapping pictures of street performers, locals trying to navigate through the masses, and children darting in and out of sight. The streets felt alive, but to Carter, they felt like a maze. And then, just as he was starting to feel the weight of frustration building, he spotted a flash of pink. It was her. Nora. She was moving between the tables of an outdoor cafe, weaving in and out of conversations. Carter's pulse quickened, and his heart leapt in his chest. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her, his eyes locked on her tiny frame. She was still alone, still walking from one diner to the next, seemingly oblivious to the world around her. The small, delicate form of the little girl stood in stark contrast to the bustling adults around her. Carter's first instinct was to rush towards her, to grab her and make sure she was safe, but he held back. He didn't want to scare her again. The last thing he wanted was for her to run off, to disappear from him a second time. This time, he needed to approach her carefully, to let her see that he wasn't a threat. He stayed at the edge of the crowd, watching as Nora moved from table to table. Some of the diners looked at her with curiosity, while others recoiled at her presence. A few offered her scraps of food or coins, but none of them seemed to truly see her. They saw a child in need, but they didn't see a person, didn't see a little girl who had been forced to grow up too fast, a girl who had been cast aside by the very world that should have protected her. Carter's chest tightened as he watched Nora's interactions. At times, she seemed almost cheerful, her small face lighting up as she engaged with the diners. But as soon as she moved on to the next table, the light in her eyes dimmed. Her small shoulders slumped, and her pace slowed, as if the world had already begun to reject her again. It was a cycle of hope and disappointment, and it broke Carter's heart to see it. A couple at one of the tables noticed her and beckoned her over. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a few crumpled bills, pressing them into Nora's hand. For a moment, the girl's face lit up, her entire being transformed by the simple act of kindness. But as quickly as the smile had appeared, it faded. The joy in her eyes was replaced by a look of resignation, as if she had learned long ago that such moments of happiness were fleeting, that the kindness of strangers could never be counted on to last. Carter's heart ached for her. It was clear that she wasn't just begging, she wasn't simply asking for handouts. There was a complexity to her situation, one that Carter hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to get by in a world that had failed her, a world that had left her with no other options but to turn to strangers for help. He felt a deep pang of empathy for her, a recognition of the innocence that still lingered in her despite the harshness of her circumstances. She was a child, no more than 8 years old, but she was carrying the weight of a lifetime of hardship on her small shoulders. And Carter knew he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when he was so close. Nora's path shifted suddenly as she darted away from the tables, moving with purpose towards a large trash bin nestled between two restaurants. Carter tensed, ready to make his move. He didn't want her to slip away again, but he knew this was a delicate moment. If he approached too quickly, she might bolt. If he didn't act now, he might lose her again, and he couldn't bear the thought of that. He held his ground for a moment longer, watching as she reached behind the trash bin, struggling for a moment before extracting a piece of cardboard. It was then that Carter's heart stopped in his chest. Nora was clutching the cardboard sign to her chest, her small hands gripping it tightly as though it was the only thing she had left in the world. Carter took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. This wasn't just a child in need of help. This was a child who had been forgotten by the system, who had been cast aside and left to survive in the streets. He knew this was the moment. He had to act now, or he might lose her forever. With renewed determination, Carter made his way through the crowd, his eyes never leaving Nora. He kept his movements slow and steady, careful not to startle her. As he closed the distance between them, he could finally make out the words on the cardboard. "Pay what you think I'm worth." The message hit him like a physical blow. It was a stark, heartbreaking reminder of the world this little girl was living in. She wasn't just asking for food or money, she was asking for her worth to be recognized. And in that moment, Carter knew he couldn't turn away. He approached her cautiously, lowering himself to her level. "Hello there," he said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle. "I'm Officer Carter. What's your name?" Nora's eyes widened at the sound of his voice, and her body tensed. She took a step back, clutching the cardboard tighter to her chest. Carter held up his hands in a placating gesture, trying to show her he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you or get you in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe." Nora hesitated for a long moment, her eyes flicking between Carter and the busy street behind him. Her small body trembled with uncertainty, and Carter could see the conflict in her eyes. She was scared, scared of him, scared of what might happen next. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Nora," she said, her voice soft and tremulous. "My name is Nora." Carter smiled, relieved to have made this small breakthrough. "It's nice to meet you, Nora. Can you tell me why you're out here all alone?" Nora hesitated again, her lower lip trembling. She clutched the cardboard sign tighter, her small hands turning white from the pressure. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," she said quietly, her voice wavering with fear. "That's very smart of you, Nora," Carter said softly, trying to reassure her. "But I'm a police officer, see?" He tapped his badge gently. "It's my job to help people, especially kids like you, who might be in trouble." Nora's eyes flickered to the badge, her gaze lingering for a moment. There was a flicker of something, hope? Recognition, before it was quickly replaced by weariness. "I'm not in trouble," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Carter nodded, understanding the fear and confusion behind her words. He needed to build trust, to let her see that he was here to help, not to hurt. "Okay, Nora," he said gently. "But can you tell me about those bracelets you're wearing? They're very pretty." Nora looked down at her wrist, where several small, handmade pink bracelets encircled her thin arm. She moved her free hand to touch them as if they provided some comfort in the midst of everything. I made them," she said softly. "You made these yourself?" Carter asked, genuinely impressed. "That's really talented, Nora. But why are you trying to sell them on the street?" Nora's face crumpled at the question, her tears welling up in her eyes. I can't," she stuttered, clearly overwhelmed. Carter's heart ached at the sight of her distress. He wanted to reach out and comfort her, but he knew he needed to maintain a professional distance. He took a deep breath and tried again. "It's okay, Nora," he said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but I need to know if you're safe. Is there someone taking care of you?" Nora nodded hesitantly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "My brother," she whispered. "But he made me do all this." The words hit Carter like a slap. "What do you mean he made you do this?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Nora's eyes widened in realization. She seemed to understand that she had said too much. "I don't want to get in trouble," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Please, I should go." Carter's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but he needed more information. This wasn't just a runaway child. This was a girl who had been forced into a terrible situation. He couldn't let her slip away now. He had to make sure she was safe. The reveal of Nora's situation. Carter could feel his heart race in his chest as Nora's words echoed in his mind. "My brother, he made me do all this." Those simple words were enough to unravel everything he had thought he understood about the situation. At first, he had assumed Nora was simply lost, maybe a child who had wandered away from her parents or guardians. But now, he was beginning to see that there was far more to the story. Nora wasn't just a runaway. She was part of something much darker, something more complex, and far more heartbreaking. Carter took a slow breath, his mind racing as he processed what Nora had just revealed. The thought that her brother was involved in her plight, forcing her into a life on the streets, made Carter's stomach churn. How long had this been going on? How many times had she been forced to beg, to sell things, to do things no child should ever have to do? He wanted to ask more questions, but he could see the fear in Nora's eyes, and he knew he had to be careful. Pushing her too hard now could cause her to shut down, or worse, run again. Instead of pressing her, Carter tried to reassure Nora with his tone. "Nora, I'm not going to hurt you, okay?" he said softly, crouching down to her level. "I just want to help you. You don't have to do this anymore." He was careful with his words, knowing that the emotional weight of what she had been through could cause her to pull away again if she felt threatened. Nora hesitated, still clutching the cardboard sign to her chest. Carter could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to trust him fighting with the fear of what might happen if she did. Her whole life had been a series of uncertainties, a constant cycle of moving from one desperate situation to the next. How could she trust anyone now? Carter understood that this wasn't something that could be fixed in an instant. It would take time. But he had to do something. He couldn't leave her on the streets, alone, with no one to turn to. He couldn't let this be just another failure. Taking a deep breath, Carter decided to take the next step. "Can you tell me where you live, Nora?" he asked gently. "Where do you and your brother stay?" The question seemed to unsettle Nora further, and for a moment, she seemed to withdraw into herself. Carter could see her struggling with what to say, with how much she should reveal. Her gaze flickered nervously around the street, as if expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. For a moment, Carter thought she might not answer at all. But then, with a quiet whisper, she pointed toward a nearby underpass, her finger trembling as it pointed in the direction of the dark, shadowy area. "There," she said quietly. "That's where we live." Carter's heart sank as he looked in the direction Nora was pointing. The underpass, a crumbling, concrete structure, was barely visible in the dimming light of the evening. It wasn't a place where anyone should be living, let alone a child. The air in the area smelled of dampness, garbage, and decay, a sharp contrast to the warm, bustling streets just a few blocks away. The thought of Nora and her brother living in such squalor, hidden away from the world, made Carter's blood boil. How had things gotten this far? How had no one seen or intervened? He nodded to Nora, keeping his voice calm. "Okay, Nora. I'm going to help you. Let's go there together, and I'll see if I can talk to your brother." Nora's small form seemed to shrink at his words, and for a moment, Carter thought she might pull away. But instead, she nodded, her eyes wide with fear. As she started walking toward the underpass, Carter kept a watchful eye on her, staying close behind. He didn't want to scare her, but he also couldn't let his guard down. He had no idea what he would find when they reached the underpass. What kind of life had they been living there? What kind of man was Nora's brother? And what would he do when he found out that Carter had followed Nora there? The closer they got to the underpass, the more Carter could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a missing child. This was about two young people who had fallen through the cracks of society, who had been left to fend for themselves in a world that had shown them no mercy. It wasn't just Nora who needed help, it was her brother, too. He wasn't just a victim in this story, he was a part of it, and Carter couldn't ignore that. He had to figure out how to help them both, and fast. As they reached the underpass, Carter's senses went on high alert. The area was dark, and the faint sounds of traffic above were drowned out by the eerie silence of the concrete jungle below. The pillars that supported the highway above cast long, haunting shadows across the ground, and the air was thick with the stench of urine and garbage. It was a far cry from the bustling city streets just a few blocks away. This was a place where people disappeared, where the world seemed to turn its back on the forgotten and the lost. Nora's pace slowed as they entered the underpass, her grip on Carter's hand tightening. She seemed smaller here, more fragile, as if the very atmosphere of the place was pressing in on her. Carter kept his hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of protection as they moved deeper into the shadows. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her to live here, in the dark, with no safety, no warmth, no protection from the harsh realities of the world above. As they moved deeper into the underpass, Carter noticed the scattered debris, old cardboard boxes, torn blankets, discarded bottles, and the makeshift shelters that had been set up by others who had nowhere else to go. The space was cluttered and chaotic, a stark contrast to the polished, orderly streets above. It was a world unto itself, a place where society had cast its unwanted. Finally, as they rounded a large concrete pillar, Carter's gaze fell on a small blue tent, tucked away in a corner where two support structures met. The tent was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. It looked weathered and patched, a makeshift shelter that had clearly been through more than its fair share of rough nights. Carter's stomach churned as he realized that this was where Nora and her brother were living. Nora pointed toward the tent. "That's it," she whispered. "That's where we live." Carter's heart sank as he surveyed the scene. This wasn't just a temporary solution to a bad situation. This was their home. This was where they had been surviving. His chest tightened with both anger and sadness as he thought about the hardships they must have faced. How many nights had they spent here, hiding from the world, from a system that had failed to protect them? As Carter stood there, taking it all in, he turned to Nora. "I need you to wait here for a moment while I talk to your brother, okay?" he said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle. Nora nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't move as Carter stepped toward the tent. He took a deep breath before calling out softly, not wanting to startle anyone. "Hello," he said, his voice steady and calm. "My name is Officer Carter. I'm here with Nora. We need to talk." There was a sudden rustling from inside the tent, followed by a string of muffled curses. Carter stepped back as the zipper of the tent flew open, and a young man emerged. He was tall and thin, with the same dark eyes and skin as Nora. Despite his apparent youth, Carter guessed he couldn't be more than in his early 20s. There was a hardness to his features that suggested a life lived on the edge of society. The young man's eyes widened when he saw Carter's uniform, then narrowed as they darted toward Nora, standing a few feet away. The young man moved protectively in front of her. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice rough with sleep and hostility. "What do you want with my sister?" Carter held up his hands, palms facing outward in a gesture of peace. "I'm Officer Carter. I found Nora on the street, trying to sell bracelets. I'm here to help, not cause trouble." The young man's posture remained tense, his eyes flicking between Carter and Nora. "We don't need your help," he spat. "We're doing just fine on our own." Carter didn't flinch. "I can see that you're doing your best to take care of Nora," he said. "But living under an overpass isn't a safe life for a child. And it's not a safe life for you, either." The young man's gaze hardened. Carter could see the weight of the years that had worn him down, the desperation, the anger, the fear. But there was also something else in his eyes. There was a flicker of something softer, something that might still be open to the idea of help, if only the right words could reach him. Carter's compassionate proposal. Carter stood at the mouth of the tent, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. The young man, Nora's brother, Mikkel, was still positioned between Carter and his sister, his posture defensive and protective, his eyes hard with suspicion. It was clear that Mikkel wasn't interested in accepting help from anyone, least of all a police officer. He had no reason to trust Carter, and Carter understood that. He had to tread carefully. Mikkel's hostility was understandable. Carter knew that in situations like this, the people involved often felt like they had been abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Nora and Mikkel weren't just living in poverty, they were living outside the system, invisible to most, struggling to survive on their own. In their eyes, anyone who represented that system, whether a police officer, a social worker, or anyone else, was a threat. They had been let down too many times. They had learned not to trust. But Carter wasn't here to hurt them. He wasn't here to tear their already fragile world apart. He was here to offer them a lifeline, to find a way to get them out of this nightmare and into something better. "Mikkel," Carter said, his voice calm and steady, "I'm not here to take Nora away from you. I'm here to help you both. To keep you together, to find a way to make sure Nora's safe. But living under an overpass isn't the answer. And I can't let you continue like this." Mikkel's eyes narrowed further, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His posture said everything. He was ready for a fight, ready to reject whatever help Carter was offering. He was trapped in a cycle of survival, a cycle that had hardened him to the point where he couldn't see a way out. "You think I don't know that?" Mikkel's voice was low, rough with exhaustion and frustration. "I know this isn't a life for Nora. But what else am I supposed to do, huh? What choice do I have? You think I haven't tried? You think I don't want to give my sister a better life? You think I want her living like this?" His voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment, Carter saw the vulnerability behind the anger. Carter could feel the weight of Mikkel's words, and they hit him harder than he expected. Mikkel wasn't just angry at the system, he was angry at himself. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, trying to care for his sister in the face of impossible odds. He was doing the best he could with the little he had, and Carter could see that. But it wasn't enough. And it wasn't going to be enough if Mikkel didn't open himself to help. "I understand, Mikkel," Carter said softly, his voice full of empathy. "I really do. I'm not here to judge you, and I'm not here to make things harder for you. But I can't let Nora stay in that tent. No child should have to live like that. I'm offering you a chance to get out of it. To get out of this cycle." Mikkel stared at Carter for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. It was a battle of wills, Carter trying to convince him that he wasn't just another part of the problem, and Mikkel trying to decide whether he could trust this stranger enough to accept his help. The tension between them was palpable, but Carter refused to back down. He knew he had to find a way to reach Mikkel. If he didn't, he was afraid they would both continue down the same dangerous path. "I have an idea," Carter said, his voice gentle but firm. He paused, waiting for Mikkel to respond. "It's not a perfect solution, but it's something. It could give us time to figure things out. A place for you and Nora to stay, where you don't have to worry about being out on the streets." Mikkel's brows furrowed in confusion, but he said nothing, waiting for Carter to explain. Carter took a deep breath and continued. "I'm proposing that you and Nora come stay with me. Just temporarily. You could stay with me at my place. I have a small apartment. It's not much, but it's safe. And it's not the streets. You could have a roof over your head, a bed to sleep in, food to eat. It would give us time to figure out the next steps, get you the help you need, find a way to get Nora into a better situation." Mikkel's eyes widened, his expression shifting from suspicion to outright disbelief. "You want us to stay with you?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and mistrust. "What, like some kind of charity case?" Carter shook his head, trying to make it clear that this wasn't about charity, it was about offering them a chance. "No, Mikkel. It's not like that. I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering this because it's the right thing to do. Because no one should have to live like this. I don't want to just hand you a handout. I want to help you get back on your feet, to give you the time and space to figure things out without worrying about where you're going to sleep tonight. Mikhail seemed to be processing Carter's words, his mind clearly racing with questions and doubts. Carter could see the walls starting to crack, just a little. Mikhail was still hesitant, but the prospect of something better, something safer, was clearly weighing on him. He didn't want to admit it, but Carter could see that Mikhail was desperate for a way out. I know it's not ideal, Carter continued, and I know it's not a perfect solution. But it's a start. A way to get you and Nora out of harm's way. And it would give us time to figure out the legal side of things, to get you the help you need. There are people who can help, but you have to be willing to trust the system again. I can't make you trust anyone, but I can promise you that I'm here to help, and I'm not going anywhere. Mikhail was quiet for a long moment. His eyes flicked to Nora, standing silently behind him, her small face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Carter could see that she was watching Mikhail closely, waiting for his decision. She needed him to make the choice. She needed him to believe that there was a better life out there for them both. Finally, Mikhail spoke, his voice low and hesitant. You really think this will work? That we can stay with you and, he paused, as if trying to say the words without sounding weak. That we can get things figured out. Carter nodded, meeting Mikhail's gaze with a steady, unwavering look. I believe it's our best shot. But it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to happen overnight. But we can make it work if we work together. I'm asking you to trust me, Mikhail. I'm asking you to give me a chance to help. Mikhail looked down at the ground for a long moment, his jaw clenched tight. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks. He didn't want to admit it, but Carter could see that the offer was tempting. The idea of something better, of not having to live in fear every day, was too much to resist. All right, Mikhail said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll try it your way. But I'm warning you, if you try to separate us, if you try to take her away from me, I won't let it happen. Carter felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew there was still a long road ahead. You have my word, he said firmly. I'm not here to take you and Nora away from each other. I'm here to make sure you both have a chance. A real chance. We're in this together. Mikhail looked at Nora one more time, and Carter could see a shift in him. The hardness in his face began to soften, just a little, and the faintest glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. All right, Mikhail said, his voice quieter now. We'll try it. As Mikhail turned to gather the few belongings they had, just a small backpack and a plastic bag filled with their few possessions, Carter felt a sense of cautious optimism. This was the first step. It wasn't the solution, but it was a start. And for the first time, he felt like he might be able to help these two young people who had been left behind by the world. The next few moments unfolded in a quiet, almost surreal way. Carter stood beside Mikhail and Nora, watching as Mikhail gathered their few possessions, a small backpack and a plastic bag containing the scraps of their life. His hands moved mechanically, packing the last remnants of their makeshift home into something that resembled a future, even if it was uncertain and fragile. The tent, the underpass, the harsh reality of living in the shadows of the city, they were all behind them now. For the first time, Carter felt like he was offering them something more than just a temporary escape. He was offering them a chance at something better, a chance at normalcy, something that felt like it had been out of their reach for far too long. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for tonight, for this moment, they had something that had been missing from their lives, hope. As they made their way back to Carter's apartment, the weight of the decision hung between them. Mikhail walked with his head held high, though there was still a guarded wariness in his eyes. Nora, walking beside him, looked up at Carter with a mixture of curiosity and wonder. She was a child, still too young to understand the full weight of what had just transpired, but she was beginning to realize that her world had shifted, that she might finally have a chance at a life free from fear. The drive to Carter's apartment was silent. The city lights blazed by in a blur of yellow and white as they passed through the streets. Carter couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope rising inside him, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. He knew the road wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, legal battles, difficult conversations, moments of doubt. But they had made it this far, and that was something. Together, they would face whatever came next. When they arrived at his apartment, Carter turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The apartment was small, modest and clean, but nothing special. It was far from the chaos of the streets, though, and that was enough. He stepped aside, allowing Mikkel and Nora to enter first. Nora's eyes widened as she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the sparse living room. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether this was real, before taking a few tentative steps into the space. She moved toward the couch, trailing her fingers along the back of it as if testing the texture of comfort, the feel of safety. "This is nice," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "It's warm." Carter smiled softly, relieved that she seemed to feel at ease, even if just for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was a home. And it was theirs, at least for now. Mikkel entered the room more slowly, his eyes scanning the apartment with a wariness that still lingered, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Carter watched him closely, knowing that he had a long way to go in earning Mikkel's full trust. But tonight, Mikkel's demeanor had softened just a little, a glimmer of hope breaking through the walls he had built up over the years. "It's not much," Carter said, trying to downplay the modesty of the place. "But it's yours for as long as you need it." Mikkel nodded slowly, his eyes flicking between Carter and Nora. "Thank you," he said quietly, though the gratitude was still mixed with suspicion. Carter could see that Mikkel wasn't fully convinced yet, but he also knew that the first step had been taken. They were here, in this safe space, and that was enough, for now. The evening passed in a quiet, almost peaceful way. Carter made a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just something to fill their stomachs, and they ate together at the small table in the corner of the room. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was the start of something better. As they sat together, Carter felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for a long time. He wasn't just an officer tonight, he was a man who had taken a risk, a man who had made a decision to help when it seemed easier to look the other way. Later, as the apartment settled into silence, Carter found himself tidying up the kitchen. He moved slowly, trying to keep his mind focused on the small tasks at hand, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Mikkel and Nora. He could hear them in the other room, Nora, her voice soft as she asked her brother questions, and Mikkel, his voice a little gentler than it had been before. Carter stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of their voices. It was a small thing, but it filled him with a sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. This wasn't just about solving a case or putting away criminals. This was about saving a child, offering a family a chance at something better. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let Nora and Mikkel slip through the cracks again. As the evening wore on, the weight of the day began to lift. Nora fell asleep on the couch, her small body curled up under a blanket, looking for all the world like a child who had finally found safety. Mikkel, though still tense, sat beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder as he watched over her. Carter stepped quietly into the living room, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over them. He glanced at Mikkel, who looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that night with something that could almost be called trust. "Thank you," Mikkel said again, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You don't need to thank me," Carter replied softly. "Just take care of each other. That's all I ask." And with that, Carter retreated to his small bedroom, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around him like a cocoon. As he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction settle over him. It had been a hard day, filled with uncertainty and difficult choices. But as he closed his eyes, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. They were safe. For tonight, at least. They were safe. The city outside was still buzzing with its usual chaos, but inside that small apartment, in the quiet of the night, Carter allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been missing for years, a sense of hope.